Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. Welcome to Tuesday, right? All right. Well, I had the opportunity last night to speak to a really good group of people, and really enjoyed that. This is my first time in Ontario, so I'm hoping and fully expecting for a good day today, both with those of you that are in the room here, and those of you that are listening online or tapped in that way. Please know that any questions you have at any time, please raise your hand and ask. Although I always try and build in time after any given presentation so that you can follow up with questions. One of the things that I like to usually share to start with is no matter where I go, there seems to be, or at least there's always some nervousness, so to speak, about, well, this guy, he's from North Dakota. Okay, why? What are we going to learn from some guy from North Dakota? And I tell the story that in this afternoon I'll talk about that a little bit. But the whole cover crop deal. How many here have heard of and or use cover crops of some sort? Okay, wonderful. This afternoon we'll talk about that a little bit more and how it ties not only to building soils and soil health, but how it applies to profitability and kind of the whole holistic realm of the people component, the financial component, in the land management component. And although that we have some really tremendous farmers in our area, just like many of you in this area. You know, I'm talking about the likes of Gabe Brown and Ken Miller and NRCS personnel like Jay Fear and others like that. But the cover crop thing that started in Burleigh County, North Dakota, came from those guys going to a conference in Kansas and listening to a speaker from Brazil give examples of cover crops in Chile. Okay, so if you can tie the knots on all of those things and kind of pull that whole web of things together, there wasn't much of any of that started or stemmed in North Dakota, but the concepts came from someplace very different than North Dakota. But the challenge is to take these concepts, these principles, the things you might hear today, and I want you to have a can-do attitude, meaning that agricultural people are some of the most innovative and creative people that there are. You just got to kind of unlock that part of your mind and then take these things and run with them and figure out how you can tweak them, you can adapt them, you can make those things work for you. Not to say that what you were doing before was bad, but how do you go from good to great, maybe? Okay, how do you just take that next step? How do you move forward? How do you tie more things that can mutually benefit or synergistically benefit in pulling your operation or the people that you work with, pulling those things together into a more profitable, more sustainable type of system, and one that doesn't drive you crazy or drive you insane. Actually, can bring a component of quality of life to the table as well. One of the ways in which I address that, and this was a real kind of aha moment for us on our place when we were grazing, and from the people that I've learned from and been mentored by, is that grazing for a lot of years was basically done under, well, it's kind of done under the discovery method, if you will. It was the whole idea that we couldn't wait to get our cattle out in the spring. Okay, calving's done, except for those few late ones. We throw them out in the pasture, and whew, we're done. Okay, the work's done. We can go discover them in the fall. Hopefully all of them are there. And we didn't have to do anything or much of anything during the summer. Maybe we check water, we check fences, a few things like that, turn the bulls out. Okay, but there can be a whole lot more to be had in a grazing management program, but you have to have some purpose behind it. You have to know why you're doing it, and it's not just to feed animals or hopefully make some money. There's more to it than that, and if you have some purpose, some identified purpose behind it, we can really accomplish a lot of things. So grazing with purpose. There's an awful lot that goes into managing grazing animals, grazing land, and to throw that extra layer of complexity on top of that and trying to make money while you're doing it. But look at the animal component, the forage component, the landscape in general, big picture. How about the people component? And of course, we didn't even put the the profitability component on there. This is just the management of the living organisms. We have that profitability part that needs to, you can do all the things in the world to enhance soil health, but if it doesn't do anything as far as increasing your bottom line, then we're either not doing the resource management part of it right, or we haven't found the optimal balance of the two to move the whole system forward rather than just one part of it being maximized and the other one's getting left behind. Unfortunately, our grazing program was like this for a lot of years. Okay, and I'm not saying this was wrong, and maybe there's, well, I'll be honest with you, I don't know much about in this area, but there's a lot of grazing management or livestock or ranching operations that these are the two main things they focus on with their livestock business or enterprise. They want to increase their profits or maybe become profitable in the first place, depending on where they're at, okay? And the second part is you're trying to meet the needs of the animals, right? Okay, whether you got beef cattle or dairy cattle or sheep or last night we had some horse people in the room. Might be goats, might be hogs, chickens, whatever it might be, whatever animals you have, you're trying to meet those needs. But you see, meeting those needs sometimes when we look at it in that simplistic of a form and don't include all the things that necessarily need to be there, we can kind of start to run down a real narrow path. Okay, kind of like this road right here. This was the winter of 2009, 2010. This is the entry road into our ranch, the one that I'm moving back to. And this is actually my father standing. The ditches are about 5 foot deep, so those are full. And then, of course, this is where we were at by the time February and March rolled around. So my point for bringing this up is a lot of times when we're managing for just a couple of things here, we also have a very simplistic view of the past, okay? And if you ask some people in our area that have farmed and ranched for a number of years, and you ask them, say you came down and visited and asked them, what's the weather like here? Do you think you'd hear about the good times? We tend not to do that in agriculture. We tend to talk about the challenging times, right? So you would hear about the flood of 1966. You would hear about the drought of 84, of 88, 89. You'd hear about the winter storm of 97 and the winter that didn't seem to stop between 2009 and 2012, okay? Seriously, it seemed like maybe we were interrupted by road construction for a few months in between there, but pretty much it was like winter for about 3 years. But many people see that worst case scenario, remember the worst case scenario, and then manage every day like it's the worst case scenario. And we miss a lot of opportunities along the way, all right? And our grazing management has started to take a bit of a different direction, and we have a long ways to go. Okay, we're a work in progress, long ways to go. But some of the operations that I will highlight here and then again this afternoon are a long ways down that road, and they are very much in the opportunistic mindset. Okay, every day or every week that they can be taking advantage of positive conditions or favorable conditions, they are. For instance, in our part of the world, it's customary to start haying in about the middle to later part of June. And you hay through the rest of that month. You hay all of July. And then between the months of August, September, October, November, you're either harvesting more, hauling more, stacking more. You have all these months connected where you're processing and making hay. Okay? Not saying that's right, wrong, or otherwise. But then all winter, what happens with that hay? It gets fed, right? All right? Now, whether we have conditions like this, or whether you're like us right now and we don't have any snow at all. It's actually very dry right now. I was telling a couple gentlemen earlier, we actually have fire warnings out right now. It is so dry in our area. Last week it was in the 70s. This week it was in the 40s. 3-4 weeks ago we were 0. Okay, I'm talking in Fahrenheit, but these big swings, and we're quite dry right now. But here's the thing. If you make hay all summer, you feel darn guilty if you don't feed it all winter. But guess what? Every day that you don't have to feed it, even if you have it, you don't necessarily lose that value. Now, don't get me wrong. It can depreciate and decline in value a little bit. It can. But Are you taking advantage of the opportunities that are presented to you, or are you like typical in our area where you start feeding hay November 1st and you feed till May 1st? Doesn't matter how good, how bad, how much supply, how much demand, it doesn't matter any of those things. Prices, any of that, you just do that. And it's very much managing for the worst case scenario and living it every day. Now, do you need a contingency plan for when things like this happen? At least do we? Yeah. We have a stockpile. We have stored feed on hand. We are ready for it if it comes, but we certainly try not to live it every day. So with your grazing management, if you've got specific purpose behind it, it makes a big, big difference in how you look at things. You see, the goals, if we're going to take a more holistic approach to this sort of thing, do we want to increase profits? Sure, that's part of it. Do we want to meet the nutritional needs of the animals? Yeah, but we're going to look a little bit bigger scope. Okay, it's not just the domesticated animals. It's not just the cows or just the sheep or the goats or whatever you're raising specifically. We also might have a wildlife component, and we sure have an underground livestock component. What do you think I mean by underground livestock component? The microbes, the soil biology. Okay, so even if you don't have livestock, or have wildlife on your property, let's say that you're just into gardening or you're just into your straight cash cropping, you still have a herd that you need to take care of. They still need food, they still need water, they still need habitat. You just can't see them very well. And most of the time, it's human nature that if we can't see things on a regular basis, do we generally give them much attention? Not usually. Let me ask you this. When you hear the word bacteria or you hear the word fungus, do warm, fuzzy thoughts come to mind? Or kind of stay away type thoughts come to mind? Okay? Well, guess what? Just like most things, there's ones that are really beneficial and there's ones that probably need to be kept in check. But guess what? If you have enough beneficial ones, what do you think happens with the ones that maybe don't that we don't like as much? They're kept in check. Okay, it's like having a I don't know. I remember in my high school days that if I ever mouthed off to an older or upperclassman, what do you think they did to me? And by the way, I only did it once. Okay, but it's the type of thing that the good guys can outnumber the bad guys, so to speak. And I wouldn't even necessarily call them bad guys. Everything plays a role. But you keep everything in check, you keep things in balance, and you get a bunch of free labor out of the whole deal. How about this here? Utilize the tools of grazing and animal impact to improve the land. Think about this. If you can improve the land so that you can grow more grass, grow more forage, have more resilient soils with better infiltration, more ground cover, more organic matter, and be raising animals that gain in weight and or breed and reproduce to where you can be gaining value going up as the animals grow and going down as you build soils. See how that's two different layers in which you're building, rather than just one of just putting weight on animals or reproducing calves, that sort of thing. We can simultaneously do several things here. We're going to try and grow as much forage as we can during the growing season. That's when we have the conditions to do so. So we're going to try and grow as much as we can, and then we're going to plan it so that during the dormant season or the winter season or the frozen tundra season, as we like to call it, we're going to ration out what forage we grew during the growing season that we have left. And we plan every year to have some left, so we have some opportunity to graze into the winter. Okay, and this afternoon I'll share some case studies or some examples of some operations that have, one in particular, that's actually grazed through the entire winter, okay, and never actually fed any hay. But we'll talk about that when we get into the cover crop part of it. Plan and survive drought and or excessive wet conditions. Whichever end of the spectrum you end up being on, we can plan for those, or at least what we're going to do when those things happen, and we'll get through them, and hopefully get through them with a lot lower stress than maybe we've experienced in the past. How about speaking of stress, how about creating a low-stress environment for animals and people? Anybody here ever do any reading, or maybe you practice this, but low-stress animal handling, stockmanship, things like that? Have you heard or listened to speakers on that? Okay. So we talk about, or some of you have heard from, how do we handle animals? And keep in mind that the low stress doesn't mean low pressure. Okay, it means strategic pressure. Animals actually respond well to certain types of pressure. It's not just walk on eggshells and be quiet and hopefully they're tame and they follow you around. I'm talking about strategic pressure to be able to move animals, start, stop, turn right, turn left, those sorts of things. But how about this second part? Low stress environment for people. How many here have ever worked cattle with family or neighbors? And some of you are laughing already. Did you get along better when you started, or before you started, or better after you got done? Before? And maybe I should ask the men, or maybe I should ask the women, or maybe I should ask the kids. I can remember when I was a kid, when my dad, who came from a family of 10, and he had 6 brothers, and of course my grandpa was there, and me and my cousin, and by the end of the day, my cousin and I, we wanted nothing to do with being anywhere on the farm after we got done working cattle that day. There was more arguing and more bosses in the corrals at any given time than we needed to. And now my father and I actually, after going to some of these low-stress animal handling classes and doing some other things and just taking our time, we actually process more cattle now than we did then, and we actually get it done quicker, just the two of us, but with a plan and with specific objectives about what we're trying to accomplish. So, and at the end of the day, we have a really good visit, and we have coffee, or we have a beer, or we talk about how we'd improve the next time. And this last one becomes real important too, integrating all other social, financial, and environmental events. What would I mean by, you probably understand the environmental part because we talked about using grazing and animal impact and growing grass. And the financial part, yeah, we want to make money. What about from a social standpoint? What might that include? Let me give an example. When we started looking at the whole increased stock density, mob grazing type thing, not just because it sounded cool, but because it's an intense use of a specific combination of tools to achieve certain goals. And when I decided that here's the 2 weeks during the year when we're going to do this on this specific acreage of land, and when my wife found out that, she just told me I better rethink that because that was also our planned vacation, which how I got this overlapped, I'm not quite sure. But you see, there became people, a greater part of our family that became real interested in the grazing plan because the quality of life part has to work for you as well. Last night there was a couple of questions that said, how do you go from just continuous season-long set stocking and go all the way to, there was one example I gave of running 300 yearlings on 1/3 of an acre at a time, moved every couple of hours. And I said, well, maybe that extreme is not where you need to be, or at least not now. You just need to be moving in that direction, and eventually you hit a point where it's about optimum for what you can handle. And that's not necessarily a critique on your ability. It has to do with how much forage you grow. It has to do with your labor availability, your time availability, your class of animal, all of those things. So putting all of these pieces together becomes really important. And if you wanted the simplistic version of it, it's basically getting animals to the right place at the right time and for the right reasons. Just because they're grass in this pasture and you move them to the next one, that's not good enough to justify just moving them. Now, do you have to move them because they're out of feed? Sure. But that's not a good enough purpose to just move to this one till this one's gone and then move to the next one and then move to the next one. You might actually be worse off in a rotational system like that than if you didn't do one at all. So there needs to be some purpose behind that. The right reasons is really, really important, and we'll talk about that. The first pillar, or the first big concept with rotational grazing or planned grazing has to do with this right here. Now, often when I talk to people and they tell me about their grazing program, the first thing they will tell me is that they move every so many days, or that their stock density is so many live pounds of animal per acre or per hectare. And although that's useful information, this is the first question I have for them is, what's your recovery time? And many times that's not even on the radar. But until we have this part here, it would be my suggestion anyway that we don't even worry about how quickly we're going to move or how high our stock density is, although those can be figured into that equation as secondary components. Without recovery time, the rest of those things don't really matter. Okay? And what do I mean by recovery time? I'm talking about when when an animal or a herd of animals grazes a pasture, they graze specific plants, and they take that first bite, and after they take that bite, if you move them then to a next pasture, say it's in a day or in 3 days or in a week, then how much time do those grass plants that just got grazed have to recover before you come back again? All right? Now, an example of how someone got really hung up on how often they move and not on what recovery time is was an example that I had on a tour that was down in Florida. And the gentleman there at a holistic management class a couple days before that said, well, I move every 3 days, and we've been doing this for quite a while, and so we're a long ways along, he said. Okay, well, can we come out and see your place? Sure, come on out. So we go out there, and we asked him to show us take us to where the paddock or the pasture that the cattle are in now. So we went there, then we asked him, show us the paddock that they're going to go to. Okay, so he showed us that one. Show us where they came from before they were in the one that they were in currently. So he showed us to that one. We were going to start looking at regrowth. And then we said, well, take us to any of the other ones so we can just kind of see all stages. And guess what he said? That was it. 3 pastures, and they moved every 3 days. How many days of recovery did any one of those pastures get in that process? 6 days. Now, I know grass grows fast in Florida. It's not quite that fast. Okay? Plus, they threw a burning event in there every once in a while on top of it, which kind of changed the dynamics a bit too. But here's the thing. You can rotate and participate in rotational grazing and rotate so quickly that you come back to a paddock that you were already in way sooner or a lot sooner than before it's ready. And did you do rotational grazing? Yes. And are you better for it? Probably not long term, because you're actually going to hurt those plants by coming back too soon. This is one reason why we look at trying to have numerous paddocks, so you have flexibility, places to go, and building in this recovery time. What does it look like below ground if we can have some recovery time? This is some work that was done many, many years ago. But what happened with these plants, and this was a mechanical treatment, but just to illustrate it, this one here was cut. The grass was cut on a very regular basis, like if I remember right, it was every 2-3 days. This one here was cut a little bit less frequently. Okay, this one here was cut a matter of weeks apart, and this one wasn't cut at all. Okay, so some people might look at that and say, well, isn't that telling us that we just shouldn't graze, shouldn't consume that forage? And I'm just saying this is what the root's like when the grass gets to this point. The reason this one is less is because every time you have a grazing event or a grazing treatment, it will slough some roots, okay, which then contributes to organic matter and nutrients and that sort of thing. If this up here is grazed once and you leave this much solar panel above the ground and it can harvest more solar energy, this will grow back. And it's just a cycle that you keep perpetuating moving forward. And therefore, we can have some really positive outcomes. Actually, the grazing animal is becoming very, very beneficial to that landscape, not just something that we can take once in a while. Actually, if they're managed appropriately, they actually add to the landscape. But if you're over in this scenario, you certainly don't have much resilience. If you get a dry spell or a wet spell, do you have much insurance or resilience built below the soil surface? Not much. And the more you continue to take, and as frequently as you continue to take it, that will be a problem. Recovery time, I think, is the most underrated part of grazing management. And it doesn't matter if you're in a dry climate. We're in about a 16-inch or about a 40-centimeter rainfall for the year in our area. I know that you're higher than that here, but I work in environments that are half of what we get. And recovery time is a very important component to grazing management in all those systems. Now, the time length of recovery that you need is going to be different. Okay, we have some places in eastern Montana that I've worked with or visited, and they will have there's a couple guys that have up to 2 years in between grazing events. Now, I visited with a couple people last night, and they talk about getting across their ground 4 or 5 times in 1 year or in one season. Now, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'd have to spend a little time here to kind of analyze that and observe that. But It has to do with, are those plants recovering to the point where they're ready to be regrazed, or are you just going back in there because there's some forage available? Because there's a difference between that. Has it gotten to the 3.5 leaf stage, or how about 4, or maybe even 5 on most of those plants, or is there just simply some green material there? So heck, we might as well graze it. That's a different take on having enough recovery time. I brought this up last night as well, and evidently made Tim a bit nervous when I talked about it. But many times with any of these concepts, if we change our frame of mind just in how we speak about it, what terminology we use, and basically how that affects our subconscious, which is ultimately what drives us, we decided a number of years ago that the idea of just building more fence just seemed like more work. More building, more maintenance, more all of those sorts of things, right? But when we started looking at it from the standpoint, okay, we're not going to just build fences. We're building fences to use as a tool to actually build recovery time, to build the ability into a system to actually manage it, to actually have choice of where we move our animals, when we move them, what type of forage we're going to move them on to. All of those things became important, but we just needed a tool to facilitate that. Now, the other thing that I appreciate is whenever people talk about tools, or even if they have tools to sell or that they market, there's two pieces to that. There's not only the tool itself, but there's the management that has to come with it, because a tool just in and of itself doesn't do you much good if you don't have the management or the concepts that go along with making that tool work for you and be successful. So in this, we talk about building recovery time, and technically that's a fence, or there's some other methods you can potentially use if you have a real large, expansive type operation. But nonetheless, tools have become a real important tool that we utilize on our place. Okay, if we get the recovery thing down and we build a system that allows us to get the recovery time that we need, then we can move to step number 2. Okay, and this is based on my experience and based on the mentors and teachers that I've learned from. The second step that we move to is then trying to minimize or eliminate the overgrazing. Okay, now this overgrazing can basically happen in kind of 3 general ways. I talked about one of them already, and that was rotating. Even if you're participating in a rotational grazing system, if you rotate too quickly, you can end up actually overgrazing. Okay, just because you moved animals doesn't necessarily mean much if you come back too quickly. The other way that it can happen is if we simply just leave animals too long in a paddock. Okay, now we've all probably seen it. If you put animals into a paddock, especially if you're into the, just one pasture for the entire season, if you come back in the fall, what does that pasture look like? Okay, it's uneven. And what have they done during the season? They went over here and they grazed this area, right? And then they grazed this area, and then they maybe grazed this area, and then where do they go back to? Back over here and back over there. And so do they have a rotation, so to speak? Sure. But what have they left in the process of all that? the awful tasting stuff, the stuff that maybe got a bit rank, the stuff that they aren't going to go after, the stuff that they didn't utilize. And so now you've got overutilization in some areas, and you've got underutilization in other areas. And if you could balance that out to where instead of taking 80% here and nothing over here, if you could take 50 and 50 or 40 and 40 or 60 and 60, whatever it is that you're to meet your needs and the nutritional needs of the animal, that would be a much better situation. So animals can stay too long in a paddock. They can return too quickly. And of course, the other part of this, which is a little bit of a tricky situation, is this one here. Technically, when grasses come out of dormancy, they're going to be in a vulnerable stage. Okay? And if that's the case, then if we graze them, especially if we graze them with any intensity when they're in that vulnerable stage, that will have an effect on the production of the rest of the season. Now, in some of the operations that I've learned from that are grazing 300, and I'm talking about around the U.S. and various places, if some of those operations that are grazing 365 days a year, during this time of most of their grasses breaking dormancy and starting to grow, the animals need to be somewhere. Okay? So is there going to be a paddock or two that's going to take a bit of a hit any given year? Sure. It's kind of like taking one for the team that year. Okay, if you've ever had one of those jobs or played that role on a team or within your job or that sort of stuff, you had to take one for the team. Well, if you have multiple paddocks, you can do that. But guess what you don't force to play that role every year and every year and every year? The same one, right? Now, if you have a calving pasture, and we've had that or at least we had that for a number of years, it worked out for a lot of reasons, based on location, based on protection, based on a few different things. And sometimes you're just going to have an area like that, and you're going to sacrifice it. But if there's any way possible to have a change in season of use, meaning that you don't graze the same pastures at the same time every year, you're going to give an opportunity to grass species that maybe didn't handle the grazing event in June real well, but maybe they handle it a whole lot better in July. Or maybe if you graze something towards the beginning of May or the middle of May, and that kind of maybe set back the cool season part of it, well, maybe the next time you graze that or the next year, it's maybe in August or something like that. So then you establish and encourage more diversity. But if you've only got one pasture or even two or three, can you do much to accomplish that type of pattern? Not really, because you don't have much choice. You kind of have just your basic choices. Now you can do something real simple with temporary electric fencing, give yourself a lot of different pastures and therefore a lot of different opportunities to change things up. Grazing management is not about a specific recipe. It's basically about managing a certain level of chaos on purpose, okay, if that makes any type of sense. How about this example here? This pasture is actually a 10,000 acre pasture. I believe this is actually in if I remember right, this is Wyoming. But this pasture is 10,000 acres in size, and there's about 100 cows grazing it. What do you see in that picture? What are some observations? Okay, erosion. What else? Overgrazing. Potential pollution, potential water quality issues. Anything else? Bare ground. So far you've identified things that we probably don't like to see, right? What do you think's happening here? Okay, we've got 100 cows, and they're pretty much just hanging out in the riparian area, right? Okay, which you wouldn't find to be uncommon. So let's take that down. Let's take 25 cows out of there. Let's only have 75. Fix the problem, right? No? Okay, let's go down to 50. Still shaking your heads. 25? You need to move the water, okay? Well, you tell me how we're going to move this particular water, but we can do some things with that concept, right? Moving is the part of this. You see, all this isn't tied up in numbers. You could have 1,000 animals, you could have 10 animals, and you could have, and potentially would have, this effect going on, right? But if we move, either provide water elsewhere or attractants elsewhere, or simply use some fencing or whatever you need to move the cattle and shorten up the exposure time. See, here's this type of pasture where they turn the cows out in, say, May, and they come back in October and get them, and this is what you find. What would happen if you turned that 100 cows into that particular area for about 10 days, and then you move them someplace else, or you use some temporary electric fence and you move them downstream just a bit further? What does this area then have the ability to do? Recoup and recover. Okay? What it never gets is a chance to come back. Because as soon as there's a little bit of regrowth, if those animals have access to it, what do they do with it? They go eat it again, and again, and again, and again. And by doing that, these plants just constantly are taking a hit. And you know, grasses can be pretty resilient, and it's probably saved all of us. At least I know it has us anyway. Perennial grasses have a resilience to them. But if we actually give them the opportunity that they need to recover, you will see how resilience can pay off in a monstrous way if we give that a chance. Let me give an example from our own place. This is from a few years ago. In this picture, do you see grass? Okay. Now it's moving into the dormant stage. It's probably not high quality, but there's quite a bit of grass there. I would agree. How about this picture? How many in here are golfers? Marble players? Okay? You could find a golf ball out there. Guess what? That's the same darn pasture. Now, I often joke that I followed the rules of grazing. I took half and I left half. Isn't that kind of a rule of thumb that you start with? Except you're supposed to take half of every plant by weight, not darn near 100% of all of this and 0% of this and average it out and you've got 50. See, my utilization is not very good, is it? And next year, when we bring the cattle back, or this, like I said, this was several years ago, so the next year when he brought the cattle back, where do you think they went to go graze first? You think they went up here? They went right back down here again. So what got beat down the year before gets beat down even further the next year. And what is over-rested and underutilized and is actually starting to die out because it's not getting sunlight down to the new growth down below actually starts to go downhill as well. So the collection of solar energy in this scenario is little to none here, and actually not all that much here because of bare ground and solar panels that are about this big. And so we're really not collecting much solar energy and therefore building biological capital and or providing feed for the animals. Now imagine if I was able to take half of this and 30 or 40 or 50% less of that. Imagine then what I would have for a solar panel out there. And that's what we're working towards. Now what could we do about this scenario? Okay, you could certainly rest it for a year. That would help this area, right? Okay, wouldn't do any favors to this one here, but it certainly would help this area. What else could you do? Okay, you could fence it and fence it strategically so that we get some impact here. Keep in mind, too, that to stimulate the mineral cycle or to stimulate the growth of those grasses, do they actually have to eat it? What else could they do to it? Trample it? Dung, urine, I mean, a number of things, hoof action, whatever, to just stimulate that ground, those soils and those plants. They don't have to eat it, and I would find it, unless you provided a heavy enough supplement of protein or molasses, energy, sugar, something, it would be tough probably to get them to eat that, but they don't have to eat it. Now, what happens if you really stimulate this, say, that next year? Whoops. Then do you need to do that every year? Not necessarily, because you kind of bring this back and give this recovery time, and pretty soon you get that whole pasture kind of on the right path. Okay? Now, the thing that I generally encourage people is that when you start with a system like this, whatever your stocking rate is now, stay there. Okay, stay there for a while. Now, what people get excited about is when they hear about grazing management, whether it's holistic grazing management or rotational grazing management or mob grazing or whatever, they hear that they can increase stocking rates. Okay? Well, that might be true, and it's probably a worthwhile goal down the future or into the future, but it's not where you start. Okay? You actually take the number of animals that you have, and if you want to start getting better utilization, something better than this here, bunch them up, put them into smaller areas, move them more frequently. But what's the first thing you have to get established? What's the number one thing, first step with grazing management? Recovery time. Okay? What's the second one? Minimizing overgrazing. Okay? And you got to do things in that order. Now think about this here. You've got this system right here, 8 pastures. Okay, that's the entire system. We're comparing this one here to this one here. So you got 8 pastures, 50 cows. This one over here, 32 pastures, still 50 cows. These move every 4 days. What do you think these move? Every day. Okay? For every 4 days you have here, you have 4 days here as well, but you have them divided up into each individual day. So by doing that then, this pasture here will end up with 3 more days of recovery time simply because you have more pastures available. Now keep in mind too that you can move this herd to one of 7 different paddocks after they're done here. How many choices do you have here? 31 different choices. Now, depending on whether you're going to go into breeding or you're going to wean calves or whether you're going to go into calving or whether you're going to turn the bulls out, there's different areas on different places that are probably better suited to handle certain type of events like that. But if you've got, first of all, if you had just one big pasture, you certainly don't have much choice. You can't manage that thing very well. If you have lots of pastures, you have lots of choices, a lot more recovery time, ability to minimize overgrazing. And speaking of overgrazing, in our area in the spring or early summer when it's fast growth time of the year, if an animal bites a plant, it will start to regrow in approximately 3 days. Okay? Around here, I would suggest that it's probably about the same during fast growth, maybe even a bit quicker. So if regrowth starts in 3 days, what's the longest that you would really want to be in a paddock if you're going to try and not overgraze, not take a second bite on regrowth? Okay, 3 days or less, right? I just told you that you were in this one for 4 days, but you're only in this one for 1 day. And this one has more recovery time. So does this scenario not give you more recovery time and the ability to avoid overgrazing, or at least a lot better chance of it? Sure it does. Now, there's lots of things to consider when you lay this out, and it would be beneficial to work with someone who has some experience in terms of laying out paddocks, putting in fence, putting in water developments if you need to. Maybe you need to develop portable type stuff, whatever it might be. But you got to put a whole system together. And this is where if you have stuff that's temporary or that you can trial and error with a bit, that becomes a really good tool or a good plan to proceed with. We're still putting up lots of temporary fence across our place because we're not exactly sure where we want it permanently or if we even want it in any given place permanently, because we're constantly trying to achieve different objectives and increase the health of the land, and having that flexibility is tremendous. Okay, two things I want to cover here to kind of close out. One is livestock. Livestock, in my mind, are either in one of two modes. They're either in performance mode, where the focus needs to be on them and their needs, or they can be in landscaping mode. And I'm serious, if we're going to utilize them as a tool, they can be during certain windows of time during the year in landscaping mode. When would animals need to be in performance mode? When do we need to focus on the animal? What times of the year? Okay, when it's raising a calf, maybe it's calving, maybe it's right after calving. What else? Breeding time. Finishing, if you're finishing some animals, for sure. Milking, possibly. Well, if you're in a dairy situation, certainly you would have a focus on that part of it. If you're going to wean calves, that might be a time for a certain class of animal. Does that tie up all 365 days of the year, those things? Actually, not even close. I shouldn't say close. Depends on how long you allow for breeding time. Or if you calve for 4 months out of the year, then maybe it does tie up quite a bit. But the point is that you have windows of time where you absolutely need to focus on the animal, because that's when you make your money, okay? When you get animals bred, when you have calves, when you're doing all of those sorts of things. But during the other times, you have the ability to use those animals and let them work for you in ways that are actually going to help you improve their land. Let me give you a couple of examples. Performance mode into the growing season. Generally, I shouldn't say it's easy, but it's easier sometimes to achieve nutritional levels that we need when things are growing, when things are green. Although it can actually be over the top if we have too much green. I used to think that keeping things in the vegetative state and grazing management was an absolute must. Okay? And the answer to that question now is, well, that depends. Okay? If it's too green, and we had some of this last fall, we had quite a bit of rain. You better not stand too close to the backside of a cow. High in protein, not high enough in energy or the fiber component. And that didn't do anything. It looked great, but it certainly didn't do much for performance. Okay? So we're looking for a balance. Plus, this sort of thing here, as far as benefit to the land, yeah, you're harvesting solar energy, but if you're not adding any carbon to the system in terms of either last year's growth or more mature type roots that you're putting in the soil, that sort of thing, we're not building much in terms of soils when you have everything in the vegetative state all the time. You're always into a high nitrogen state and a lower carbon state, which the land most of the time is carbon starved, not necessarily nitrogen starved. If we get into the dormant season, then we talk about a different type of method. But during the dormant season doesn't mean you stop rotating or you stop having a planned movement of animals. In fact, you can facilitate good nutrition through most of the winter months or dormant season actually by moving actually quicker. Okay, even though we're in a non-growth period, we can actually give them a fresh plate of food or feed every day and actually keep their nutrition requirements a bit higher. Let's move to this landscaping mode here real quick. One of the things that we can do, we can stimulate the mineral cycle. This area up here was on a ranch not too far from where I'm at. And although this picture is maybe a bit hard to see, there's quite a bit of gray oxidizing grass in there. It's had a lack of impact. This is like a few years beyond where that tall brownish yellowish grass that I showed in the picture on our place with the horse. Okay, remember the part that just didn't have much going on other than it was a bunch of rank forage standing there. This is like a few years beyond that. It's starting to lay over. The plants are starting to die. 1 year of impact or one grazing event. The next year we not only have green material, we've got more diversity coming in. We've got some forbs, some legumes, some additional grasses. But following that impact on that ground, what was the next tool that had to be put in place? What do you have to follow a grazing event with? Recovery time. And I know I keep throwing that out there, recovery time, recovery time, recovery time. And if you leave with nothing else today, that needs to at least be part of hopefully what you remember. This one here is another one. We end up with having quite a bit of brush on our place. If it doesn't have impact for a long time, we didn't have to put fences in for this one. All we had to do is provide salt licks or mineral. You've probably all seen when 2, 3 cows get around a feed trough or a feed tub or a loose mineral or a salt block. What do they tend to do? If they all want some and there's only so much space to be had, okay, they start to stir around it. They start to move around it. You can create a bit of a mobbing effect without using fencing in real specific targeted areas. That's what we did here. We don't want to get rid of all of this buckbrush or western snowberry. We just want to open it up a bit so that we can have some diversity of plants growing in that particular area. This is one real quick where if you have enough impact, you can actually change the plant communities. Okay, over here on the right was crested wheatgrass for the most part, which is a very dominant tame grass in our area, planted on a lot of ground that never should have been farmed in the first place because it was just blow sand. But once it got established, it doesn't let go to let anything else in it. People have tried to plow it out, tried to spray it out, tried to do lots of things, and quite honestly, the best thing we have found is actually providing quite a bit of impact from animals themselves, and in 2 years totally changed this from crested wheatgrass to western wheatgrass, which is a native grass in our area, has a larger alfalfa component, and then there was even some native vetches and stuff that were starting to come in there. That was a landscaping thing that could be utilized. How about this one here? What do you see? Okay, stream bank erosion. How deep do you think the cows sink in when they try and get water out of here? A couple inches? A couple feet? Okay, probably talk about some water quality issues. We've got overgrazing. The stream bank probably every year is moving back a bit further, cutting a bit deeper. Okay, this was before any management took place. This was a set stock, turn the cows out, let them do whatever they do. After studying some holistic management, going to some different courses, going on tours, this is a ranch in North Dakota. They made some big changes over the course of about 4 or 5 years. It included some fencing, it included some water development, but most importantly out of all that, it included a mindset change of how they're going to manage differently. And it was about 7 years later, this is that same stream bank. And this was in the early to mid 90s, so I need to go. I've been on the place since, but not back to this particular lake that they've got, and I'd like to take another picture of it because it's even better. You know, a lot of times in an area like this, we've got nothing. Well, here we've got something, and you might look at some of those, or at least people in this area, and say, well, yeah, but that's not the species I want. Okay, well, first of all, you have something growing and you have cover. The second thing is you have to go through some stages. Okay, you don't just jump from bare ground and overgrazing to lush, diverse pastures with all of the species that you want. You actually go through some what we would call weed phases or simple successional type phases. And as you proceed through those, then you eventually get to that perennial, diverse type of forage that you're looking for, and that's why probably a follow-up picture needs to be a part of it. How about this one? Some observations yesterday were overgrazing, maybe some bare ground starting to develop, probably too much impact, and the conclusion was, well, there's probably too many animals. How many animals? And you remember the other watering stream one where we talked about how many animals? Was the number of animals the problem? Now, you can have a stocking rate or you can be over your carrying capacity. I understand that. Your whole system is going to support a certain number of animals and you need to abide by that. But in any given area on that place is not subject to the number of animals. It's subject to the amount of time. Because here we'd be judging a book by its cover because after appropriate recovery time, this is what it looks like. Here we actually have a tremendous filter. They actually, on this ranch in central Montana, they call themselves net importers of topsoil. Why? Because any topsoil that comes in, we've got grass that's growing all the way through the water. Guess where it settles and sits? Okay, so they're actually bringing in water that they keep. They're bringing in soil that they keep. And he said, just don't tell my neighbors what's happening. But long story short is that with the neighbors and with that whole area starting to work and move in this direction, everybody can have some benefit. It doesn't have to be a competition, one versus the other. They can all have beneficial. I'll share with you one last example, and then I'll close here. This was actually, anybody here heard of Neil Dennis, Saskatchewan? Okay, a few of you guys. Well, he's been another gentleman that I've become pretty good friends with, and he's been a mentor of mine, and I always enjoy spending time with Neil because for those of you that have met him, you know that he's quite the character, and he's definitely, for instance, he'll come up to North Dakota in the middle of the winter, and he'll wear shorts, and I'm not just saying any shorts. I mean like fiery orange shorts and sandals, and that's just how he is. He's kind of a firecracker type person that way. But anyway, on his operation, his first exposure to kind of mob grazing and the positive effects that can happen from grazing and animal impact came almost by accident. He brought in some of his neighbors' heifers onto this area that is it's all thistle. Now, if you're from Canada, maybe you don't call it Canada thistle. In Quebec, they say it's not Canada thistle, it's California thistle. But whichever, there was just a boatload of thistle in this area right here. So he brought 330 heifers in on 2/10 of an acre. And he left them there for a short period of time, 2 days. Okay? Now, they at night, I believe, he let them back out so they could, or a couple times a day to get water, but then he would camp them back in here for a short period of time. Now, if you tell me that animals will not eat thistle, animals will actually eat a whole lot more than what we think. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should force them onto something that they're going to do poorly on, but the more that our animals just have this wide open selection and get to walk on what they want and graze what they want, and they don't have to eat anything other than what people would call the ice cream and chocolate maybe, guess what they get used to? Okay? Imagine if your kids were if they only had to eat those things, if those are the only things that they got to choose every time, after a while, would meat or potatoes or vegetables or fruits, that sort of stuff, would that even appeal to them? At least my kids, it sure wouldn't. But the point is that, especially for a short period of time, we can accomplish some things. Now, they didn't have to even eat so much of this. Now, they ate some of it, but what did they do? What does it look like they did with a lot of it? Trampled it down, which is another way to impact it the same way and not necessarily have to put it all through the gut of the animal. What has to follow a significant, intense grazing event like this? Recovery time. I know you're going to probably want to throw up the next time I say that. But it's true. So what did he do? A whole year's worth, and this is what it looked like. Now there's still some thistle out there, but there's a whole lot less. So what did he do the following year? Same thing, and then recovery time after that, and 4 years later, here you go. You can't find a thistle plant out there now. Okay? Now, after you move from an intense event like this, plus recovery time, then you can move into maybe what you'd call more of a maintenance type of grazing. Okay? You maybe don't have to be that intense, but does that mean that, oh, the problem's fixed, we don't ever have to graze it again, which is what I've been exposed to on certain types of land management that were anti-cows, but yet the cows fixed it, and then once the cows fixed it, then the cows were basically excommunicated from that area. So then we move into maybe more of a little more of a basic rotation, or at least something that's not necessarily as intense. Now you could keep up the intensity, but you wouldn't necessarily have to. This was a specific objective that was to be achieved by using the tools of fencing and animals tied with the management of it. What are your objectives on your place? What are you trying to accomplish? If you sat down and made a list of 5 things that you were going to try to accomplish on your grazing operation, what would they be? Or you simply just turning animals out there and hoping that things stay the same, don't get worse. Maybe they get a bit better if it's a good year. But we have so much more potential than that if we actually put some planning into it. Now, we're always balancing land performance versus livestock performance. Okay? Could we get more pounds of beef in a given year if we'd go and just consume everything and scorch it right to the ground? We could. But then you got to worry about what you're going to do next year. Okay? At the same time, could we just barely graze it and maybe just do recovery for a whole year and not graze any animals? Well, you could. And there's been a couple places that I've seen some ranchers take over to where they rented or leased for an entire year and didn't put a single animal on it for that purpose. And they were light years ahead of the game by doing that for 1 year, taking that big hit 1 year, but getting that land started off in the right direction. So there's always this balance that we're going to play with land performance and animal performance. But once you build the health of the entire system, soils, plants, animals, that entire complex will kind of carry all of it with it. Okay, once you start getting it rolling and get it on the right track, all of those things will feed positively into the next stage. This is not my excavator or backhoe, but one of the things that many times really gets forgotten is people will dive in. They will build infrastructure. They maybe even will do some planning. They will pay attention to recovery time. They will try and minimize overgrazing. They'll do all these things. And then the closure to the whole thing to know if what you want is actually happening requires this. A lot of people, they'll look at things. They'll observe things. But are you actually taking any measurements? Are you actually quantifying the advances or progress that you're making? And if you're not, we need to do something about that. Now, maybe you're not the person in your family or in your business that's going to be the one to do the monitoring. That's fine, although I would encourage everybody to do a little bit to start with so you learn the process, you learn what to look for, and it's going to help you decipher the numbers that you do get down the road. Maybe you utilize a consultant. Maybe you utilize someone that works with another agency or organization, but monitoring needs to be the closure component to making all of this come together. Otherwise, you might be doing some really good things, or you might think you're doing a lot of really good things, and just because you're able to do it again and farm or ranch again the next year doesn't mean you're making as much advancement or progress as you could be. But monitoring data will actually help tell you whether you're moving in that particular direction. And what does that take? That's not waiting for the whole thing to collapse and then saying, oh, I guess that didn't work. It has to do with getting out there on your hands and knees with a shovel, with a tape measure. You don't need to know all your plants. You don't need to know, but you can get down on your hands and knees and you can tell or measure whether there's more bare ground or less bare ground. Okay, how many plants you have per square foot? What kind of diversity you have out there? What stage are those plants at? If you're going to be good at grazing management, you need to be a bit of a grazing or a grass farmer, so to speak. Becomes really, really important. Okay, Let me ask you one last question. Problem versus symptom, cause versus effect. Do you experience any of these things, or have you ever experienced any of these things? We have. And every one of those, maybe not completely, but every one of those is a function of our management. Okay? Now, this last one down here, droughts and floods, I'm not going to say that you're going to eliminate those things, but you certainly have some influence on how you manage your land to buffer yourself from the extremes of those things. But all of these other things, for the most part, and I'm not saying we have it perfect because we certainly don't, but we constantly have to look at what's causing the problem. What's the root cause of the problem? And more times than not, it's our management. In our case, it certainly was. Maybe it'd be different in your situation, but our management has caused weeds or insect damage, low forage production, or poor animal performance. Overgrazing is not because we had a bunch of stupid cows. In fact, it has nothing to do with the intelligence of the animals that we have. Often people will say, well, horses are terrible grazers and so are sheep. Cows are better. We run horses in a rotational system actually with our cows. Do they graze differently? Certainly they do. But it's not because the horses have been a part of grazing landscapes for a long time. Sheep, the same way. And I've custom grazed sheep before. And if you manage them appropriately, they can do some really good things for the land. But it's all tied up in management, and so are all of these things. And of course, from a holistic perspective, we've got to tie all of this together. And I'm not saying that's easy, but if we're constantly asking ourselves, how does this decision that we're about to make, or this action we're about to take, how does it affect us financially? How does it affect our resource base? And how does it affect us from a family standpoint, or a social standpoint, a people standpoint? Because you can drive yourself crazy and end up really profitable and in really good soil health, but if at the end of the day you are not excited about it and you're so worn out that you can't keep that up, that's not sustainable either. So all three of those pieces got to come together. The last of the old way is always easier than the first of the new. If you're going to make a change, don't expect everybody else to come with you. Okay? And in fact, you might give them plenty to talk about at the coffee shop, or you might have something that you do different that is going to be talked about in whatever circles. I've kind of gotten to the point where if I didn't try a bunch of these different things, I don't know what all of those people would talk about, because they sure talk about all of the crazy and many times idiotic stuff that they say we try. But we're actually experimenting, and we're getting further down the road, and we're getting more profitable, and we're making some progress, and I've learned that from a lot of other people. And by doing that then, I can honestly say that you can have something that can be more than just 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, if you start using biology in your system and start appreciating that part of it, if you start connecting the soils with the plants, with the animals, and letting that whole network, that whole complex work, there is an awful lot of heavy lifting that nature can do for you. Okay, the one most limiting factor that most people identify is not even money, it's time. Anybody here have extra time on their hands? Okay, most people kind of put their head in their hands when that happens, or really identify with having a lack of time, and I still identify with that for sure. But if we had more time, you'd have more time to think, you'd have more time to plan, you'd have more time to observe, to monitor, all of those things. And if you had more time to do those things, could your operation be better? Certainly could. But when we're too busy doing all of the jobs that either the animals could do, or the plants could do, or the soil microbes could do, we're going to be stretched pretty thin, because we're trying to do so much, and much of that we maybe certainly wouldn't have to. So I get pretty excited about actually being the black sheep, and maybe there's plenty of black sheep in this room, but if you are, be a bit proud of that. Don't be. We don't always have to follow the herd, so to speak.